Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to Seriously Now. I'm Lex Carline, and I hope you're having a wonderful week so far. I'm sorry this is a couple of days late. I'm going to blame the fact that it was my birthday on Tuesday, so I'm now 36 years young. Woohoo! And it's got absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I was behind on a uni assignment or that I had to change case halfway through the week. Nothing at all. So this week I was going to cover the Luke Mitchell-Jodie Jones case, which many of you may be aware of. I followed it relatively closely for quite a long time, then kind of lost touch when I had my daughter and realised that actually in these last few years there have been a massive amount of developments and it's going to take me a lot longer to get through it all, to put together a comprehensive episode with as much information as possible for you. So that one will be back in a couple of weeks. Sorry. So this week, instead, I'm going to talk to you about another Scotsman. Completely unintentional, but we are going to talk about Dennis Nilsen. Now, Nilsen murdered at least 12 young boys/men. And a trigger warning before we start this, that today's case has dismemberment and necrophilia along with the murder. Oh, it's a lovely one. Dennis Nilsen was born on November the 23rd, 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland, to parents Elizabeth Duthie White, also known as Betty, a Scottish national, and Norwegian soldier Olav Magnus Moksheim, and he had adopted the surname of Nilsen. Olav's main focus was the Free Norwegian Forces, which meant that he often neglected his family, and as such Nilsen's home was an unhappy one. It's said that the three Nilsen children, older brother Olav Jr., Dennis and younger sister Sylvia, were conceived on Olav's brief visits home. He wasn't there much at all. And after Nilsen's mother had realised that she had rushed into marriage without thinking, she left Olav. Maybe should have thought about that sooner, but never mind. She and the three kids moved in with her father, whom Nilsen loved. And he would later claim that the sudden and unexpected death of his grandfather from a heart attack whilst fishing, and Nilsen was only 6 at the time and saw the body, which traumatised him, he said this would lead to his behavioural psychopathy and was what led him to withdrawing from society, which is really sad. His mother would go on to remarry and have 4 more children. And in an interview in 1999, the then 83-year-old Betty would describe Nilsen as a kind and caring child. He would bring home injured birds under his coat for protection. She also said that people may find it funny to carry on loving your son. It's not funny when it's your own. She would even provide reporters with photographs of Nilsen for the papers. She said she wanted the son she knew to appear and not the unrecognisable person she was reading about. Oh, it must be really difficult for the parents of people like this. Hopefully I will never be in that position. There was, however, an element of defensiveness in Betty's interview, and she stated, "It's nothing I had done. He was brought up the same as the others." Which, fair enough, I suppose. She lost contact with him when he joined the army, and letters she sent were found unopened in his flat, and she just said that he was peculiar like that. Sounds like we know where he gets his peculiarity from. In his early teens, Nilsen discovered that he was gay, which he found confusing and shameful, and unsurprising really given the time that he was growing up in. So he would have been a teenager in the late 50s, early 60s. And allegedly being confused about his sexuality, Nilsen fondled both of his siblings in their sleep. Now, even if you're confused about which gender you like, your siblings are not the way to go. That's a whole other level of confused. When his older brother Olav found out about Nilsen's sexuality, as you can imagine, because siblings often do terrorise each other, he did. He began taunting him, especially in public. Nilsen claimed to have had no sexual encounters as a teenager as a result of this. He thought that the army would take him away from the rural locations he'd been raised in, which is a fair plan. So age 14, he joined the cadets, and at age 16, he enlisted in the army. He served 9 years, well, 11 in total. So kind of, I suppose, following in the footsteps of his absentee father. Well, not quite, because you see, Nilsen wasn't actually a soldier. Oh no. He worked as a cook. Yeah, he actually served as a butcher in the Army Catering Corps. Now, these skills, as we will see, would clearly serve him well during his murderous spree. And whilst in the army, in order to curb his sexual desires, and also probably to avoid detection, Nilsen would shower alone. Although there was one instance while he was serving that would lead to some erotic fantasies. Hey. He was serving as a private in West Germany, and he and a colleague had drunk themselves silly. Nothing out of the ordinary there. And he woke up on the floor of his flat. I think we've all had nights where we've passed out and woken up and gone, how did I get here? Now, nothing sexual happened with the colleague, but it did fuel these fantasies. And I think I can speak for most, if not all of us, that at some point we have had fantasies about someone we maybe shouldn't, or someone that it's clearly never going to happen with. But Nilsen's fantasies, well, these involved a young, slender male sexual partner who was completely passive, or unconscious, or dead. Yeah. Now, can't say I've ever gone that far in my fantasies. To each their own, sort of. But as long as it stays in your head. And as I'm talking to you guys about this man, it's clear that that was not the case. Now, after leaving the army, Nilsen decided to join the Metropolitan Police. Oh, there's so many things we could say about them, but I don't want to get sued. Because the powers that be have those special protections that us normal folk don't. So, yeah. Nilsen moved to London to begin his training. It was there he discovered his fascination with morgue visits and autopsied bodies. Is it weird that I kind of am intrigued by that? I did at one point think about being a mortician. That was about as far as it got. In 1973, he concluded his police training. Nilsen would claim that his early months on the force were extremely lonely, and that he longed for the companionship he had become accustomed to in the army. As a miserable junior constable, Nilsen began drinking alone in the evenings and then visiting gay bars. From there, he engaged in casual sex. Now, despite the obvious advantages of police work being able to fuel his morbid tastes, a year later, he left the police and began a career at the job centre as a recruitment consultant. In 1973, Nilsen had his first run-in with the law, from the wrong side. A man named David Painter, whom he had met through work, accused Nilsen of taking pictures of him in his sleep. Painter was allegedly so incensed that he required hospitalisation after their confrontation. Whew, I'm assuming for some sort of sedative. Now, Nilsen was questioned, but he was released without charge. In 1975, Dennis Nilsen and David Gallichan moved to a garden apartment, 195 Melrose Avenue in North London. Gallichan was 20 at the time, and Nilsen was 10 years his senior. Now, many sources refer to Gallichan as Nilsen's partner. However, Gallichan has said that it was not sexual, and I just wonder if that was because of the times. During the relationship, the couple adopted a dog for just £1 from a pet shop. That's about £7.50 today. Bleep was a black and white female mongrel who was said to be both shy and kind. She garnered her name as, bless her, she couldn't bark, and she just made these little high-pitched squeals. Nilsen loved this dog. He fed her, walked her, would do anything to protect her. So, at least he was a decent dog owner? Sadly, the relationship would only last a year before arguments caused the couple to split, with David moving out and Bleep staying with Nilsen. This is when it said Nilsen's life took a downward spiral into alcohol and loneliness, which is a very dangerous combination. Over the next 18 months, he became increasingly disturbed by his sexual encounters, which only added to his loneliness. Let's face it, some people can have one-night stands and brush it off like it was nothing. Some can't. Some, no matter how good the sex was, will feel empty or dirty or lonely, and it's not wrong to feel either way. I'm definitely the latter. It's just how you deal with it that counts. And Nilsen, as you may have guessed, did not deal with it well. Shush, Tommy. 18 months or so after David left, Nilsen would meet Stephen Holmes, who was just 14. They met in the pub on the 29th of December 1978, and Nilsen took him home. The next morning, Nilsen was battling his overwhelming fear of not wanting to be alone. And so he would strangle Stephen with a tie and then drown him in a bucket of water. Not sure how that really combats the not being alone, but... No, once Stephen was dead, Nilsen washed the body in the bathroom and put it in his bed. As you do. He would later say that he found the corpse beautiful. And as such, he would try, although unsuccessfully, to have sex with him. And he did spend the night sleeping next to the body. Then he disposed of the body, right? Right? Sort of. Nilsen would put Stephen's body under the floorboards of his flat. Lucky that he was on the ground floor / basement. There he would stay for the next 7 months. Imagine, if nothing else, the smell. It was the middle of winter when he murdered him. Heating, decomp. You get where I'm going? Ugh. Poor Stephen. October 1979, and Nilsen had another very close call with police. One they probably kicked themselves for a few years later. Nilsen tried to strangle Hong Kong student Andrew Ho during bondage play back at his flat. Now, luckily, Andrew managed to get away, and he did report the incident to the police, but he declined to press charges. Purely speculation here, but possibly that was due to the stigma that was still attached to being homosexual, or maybe he hadn't told his family and he didn't want to be outed that way. Lots of potential reasons why he didn't press charges, but God, do we wish he had. On the 3rd of December 1979, Nilsen would meet Kenneth Ockenden, a Canadian tourist. Guess where he met him? Yep, also in the pub. Nilsen offered to show Kenneth all the lights and all the sights and take him on a bit of a tour around London for some sightseeing and drinking. The pair, surprise, surprise, then ended up at Nilsen's apartment. Here he would strangle Kenneth with a wire from a pair of headphones, and he even took Polaroid pictures of the body as a souvenir. He again washed the corpse and spent the night sharing his bed with it. This time, he was successful at having sex with Kenneth's body. Kenneth would also be stored under the floorboards, but Nilsen would take him out and talk to him like he was still alive. I know murder takes, obviously, a certain degree of madness or loss of control, but this is just mental instability on a whole nother level. Nilsen's third victim was Martin Duffy. He was a 16-year-old catering student from Merseyside, and he'd been sleeping rough since moving to London. So Nilsen invited him to spend the night on the 13th of May 1980, just 5 months after his last victim. And I imagine Martin, who'd been sleeping rough, was like, yeah, great, somewhere warm and dry and hopefully comfortable. Poor lad. Now, mirroring Stephen's murder, Nilsen would again strangle and drown Martin. But this time, rather than directly defiling the corpse, he masturbated over it. So, still defiling in a sense? Just, rank. Well, it's all rank, but... Martin's body was kept in a wardrobe for 2 weeks before he joined the other two under the floorboards. Now, Nilsen's flat was smelling pretty bad by now. And there must have been plenty of bugs, because we know bugs love bodies. Billy Sutherland was Nilsen's fourth victim, a 27-year-old prostitute who followed him home and was strangled for his troubles. Malcolm Barlow would become his fifth victim, and he was a 23-year-old who was an orphan with learning disabilities. Nilsen strangled him too. Oh. Oh. By the time of Malcolm's murder, Nilsen was said to have murdered 12 young men and boys in his flat. It was a small apartment, and given how many unwilling roommates Nilsen had, there wasn't a lot of space left, so poor Malcolm's body was put underneath the kitchen sink. Now, out of the 12 victims of Melrose Avenue, as far as I could find anyway, the only ones that I have been able to give names for are the only ones that have ever been identified other than 26-year-old William Sutherland. But given that many were homeless and or unemployed in such a big city as London, where disappearances and things happen all the time, these did not draw as much attention as they maybe would have in a smaller place. Nilsen would later claim that he would go into a killing trance, but he did let 7 men go simply because he was able to snap out of it, rather than going through with killing them. Shame he couldn't do the same for all the others, but then if you know you go into this killing trance, why would you be inviting people over? You know? Oh, I might unalive you if I take you home. Trance or not. Fully capable of understanding his actions. And so therefore fully culpable for his actions. Now, as we said, after Malcolm was killed, there was very little space in the apartment, and Nilsen was said to have to spray the rooms a couple of times a day just to kill the mass amounts of flies and to help combat the smell. But somehow when his neighbours complained about the smell, he convinced them that it was from structural problems with their building. Really? Really? Now I know we can all be gullible at times, but really? In order to dispose of the bodies, Nilsen would get naked. Great. And would dismember them on his kitchen stone floor. Limbs would be buried in the garden and the shed. Torsos would be stuffed into suitcases until he could burn them in the garden. And he was said to disguise the smell by also burning tyres. 'Cause burning rubber. Stinky. Sometimes the bonfires would be going all day. This next bit's a bit grim, but he was said to boil the skulls of his victims to help remove the flesh, put their organs in plastic bags ready to be disposed of, and once everything had been burned off the bones, he would crush them and scatter the fragments around his garden. Now, I don't know why, but I just have this little image in my head of him with this pouch of ground bones, just sort of sprinkling them around like confetti. Not sure why my brain's gone there, but thought I'd share that with you. In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord gave him notice that they wanted to renovate the apartment and offered him £1,000 to move out. Now that's £1,000 in 1981. We're talking 40 years ago. Imagine anything like that happening today. Normally you just, sorry, want my house back, you need to go. Obviously Nilsen accepted and burned the remaining bodies before vacating. Now either he cleaned it very well, or the landlord must have had some serious questions when they got their flat back. But anyway, in an attempt to curb his murderous ways, Nilsen moved to a top-floor apartment, 23D Cranley Gardens. And that was in Muswell Hill in North London. So as well as it being a top floor, so no convenient floorboards, because that'd be soaking through into downstairs' ceiling, there was no garden either. But unfortunately, as is often the case, the leopard did not change his spots. And shortly after moving in, he lured 23-year-old John Howlett to his flat. There, he strangled and drowned him. A year later, so 1982, Nilsen would lure 21-year-old Carl Stotter to his flat. Carl was resting in a sleeping bag on Nilsen's floor, but his plan to kill Stotter didn't actually go the way he'd envisaged. Carl would later go on to testify that he initially thought Nilsen was trying to free him from the zipper of the sleeping bag and vaguely recalled hearing running water in his sleepy haze. Then he realised that he was actually immersed in the water and Nilsen was trying to drown him. He said, "Nilsen was behind me, kneeing me in the back and telling me to keep still. No air was going into my lungs and all I could feel was the teeth of the zipper digging into my neck as he pulled tighter. I briefly felt blood from the wound trickling over my skin, and then I passed out." And here comes Bleep the dog to save the day. Good girl. When Carl passed out, Bleep allegedly started licking his face, and this brought him round. Then, in an extremely unexpected twist, Nilsen let him go. Yeah. Even walking him to the tube station. Carl was very badly injured and extremely disorientated, and when he looked in the mirror, he was very confused by his reflection. His face was bloated, his tongue was swollen, there were burst blood vessels in his eyes and bleeding cuts to his neck. From the tube, Carl would go straight to the hospital. And it was actually the doctors who told him that he needed to go to the police because they said it looked like someone had tried to kill him. You imagine? Jesus. Unsurprisingly, this was said to haunt Carl for the rest of his life. He never understood why Nilsen let him go, and not the others. He even wrote to him in prison to try and get some answers. But funnily enough, Nilsen didn't reply. Detective Sergeant Chris Healy said that Carl was very, very reluctant to testify against Nilsen. And he said that he himself paid for Carl's taxi to get him to court, which was just how it was back then. He also said that Carl was shaking the whole time. Oh, bless him. But fair play to him for actually going through with it and testifying. But unfortunately, Carl would never get over what happened to him and the others. And sadly, after struggling with alcoholism since the trial, he slipped into a diabetic coma in his flat and died in January 2013. Carl's sister Julie said that whilst Nilsen didn't actually kill his body, he certainly killed the Carl she knew and idolised as a child. And even more horrifically, Julie lost her 19-year-old son Jack to suicide. He left a note saying that he didn't want to end up like Uncle Carl. Julie also holds Nilsen responsible for Jack's death, which is, it's just fucking awful, isn't it? So, back to 1982, and Nilsen would strike again. He offered 27-year-old Graham Allen a meal at his flat. And obviously that's where he killed him as well. He stored Graham's body in his bath for up to 3 days. And he later told police that he couldn't remember the exact moment he killed Graham. But he did remember approaching him as he ate an omelette, fully with the intention of killing him. In 1983, Nilsen would murder his final victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair. His body would be dissected, with some parts being stored in plastic bags and stored in the wardrobe, and also the drawer beneath the bath. Don't think I've ever seen a bath with a drawer beneath it, but... Now, obviously, with the lack of garden and stuff, the disposal of his victims was not as easy. So whilst he would still dissect bodies and he would boil the heads, hands and feet to remove the flesh, and then the flesh along with organs and smaller bones, Nilsen would flush down the toilet, and the rest was disposed of using carrier bags. Ugh. So unsurprisingly, in February 1983, all of the flushing clogged the drains. And what's even more surprising, or I suppose he could be trying to cover his backside, but I didn't have anything to do with it. Nilsen notified the estate agents of the blockage so they could call Dino Rod, drain specialists, to come and investigate. We love a dumb criminal on this podcast, don't we? Now, there were 5 other tenants living at Cranley Gardens, and none of them really knew Nilsen. But when Dino Rod came, Nilsen and the other tenants witnessed drain technician Michael Catron discover human remains. It was said to be a flesh-like substance that was being eaten by rats, along with multiple small bones, and that was when he'd gone through just the outdoor manhole. Could you imagine finding that? You think you're going to go and deal with probably too much toilet paper to block a drain or an extra large poop, and you get that. I'd be thinking, I'm not paid enough for this, thank you. So the technician reported the nasty findings to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler, and the two decided that they'd have another look the following morning just to be certain when the light was better. Presumably hoping that it was just a big misunderstanding and not something as horrific as it was sounding. Nilsen even tried to throw Catron off by saying it looked like someone had been flushing their KFC. I'm so glad I don't like KFC, because it doesn't agree with me. Well, that might have put me off for life, so sorry. Now, in something that kind of baffles me as to why he did this after Dino Rod were called and not before, Nilsen further tried to cover his tracks by removing the remains from the drain overnight. I mean, he was obviously aware at this point that he was likely to get caught, and he was allegedly spotted by a downstairs tenant doing so. On the 9th of February 1983, Nilsen supposedly told a colleague that if he wasn't in tomorrow, he would either be ill, dead, or in jail. So the drain technicians, Catron and Wheeler, returned the next day and were highly surprised to find the drain had been cleared. Although they did find 4 bones, which looked like they were from a human hand, along with scraps of flesh leading from the drain to Nilsen's top floor flat. This is when the technicians did the right thing and called the police. That evening, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. wanted to question Nilsen about the found remains, as I imagine he would have spoken to everyone in the building. When he entered Nilsen's apartment, he noticed an extremely foul odour and asked what it was. Now, what is mind-blowing to me is that Nilsen just calmly confessed that what they were looking for was stored in bags around the apartment, including 2 dismembered heads and other body parts. Once Nilsen was arrested, he sang like a canary. Nilsen allegedly said, "It's a long story. It goes back a long time. I want to tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest. Not here, at the police station." Now, obviously, Nilsen was able to provide extensive details about his killings, and he admitted that there had been 15 young victims. Also, despite legal caution, you can just imagine his brief sat there going, no, don't dig yourself any further, don't make the hole bigger. Nilsen admitted to attempting to kill another 7, but could only name 4 of the men, boys. One minute he was said to show no sign of remorse and believed that his murder method was humane, which earned him the nickname the Kindly Killer. But the next minute he was worried about the public's attitude towards him. Nilsen was said to be eager to assist police with gathering evidence against himself, and he even took them to his old address to point out specific details about how he disposed of his victims. When the garden and field were dug up behind Melrose Avenue, more than 1,000 bone and teeth fragments were discovered. Yowza. Now, after his confession, Nilsen was held at Brixton Prison, and whilst awaiting trial, he wrote over 50 notebooks of memories to assist the prosecution. He drew sketches that he called sad sketches, and these detailed the treatment of some of his victims. He even boasted that he was the killer of the century. Oh, get better goals! And that he'd killed more than Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe. What an achievement. Ugh. So we know Nilsen was a bit, is tapped the right word? Am I allowed to say that now? But yeah. And in the run-up to his trial, he fired his legal counsel, then rehired him, and then fired him again. His trial began on October the 24th, 1983, and he'd been officially charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. And remember how he was quite happy to give all the detail and to show them where he'd done everything? Well, Nilsen pled not guilty. And he claimed this was due to diminished responsibility due to a mental defect. The prosecution heavily relied on Nilsen's interview notes, and it took over 4 hours to read verbatim to the jury. And this was along with the testimonies of the 3 survivors, Paul Nobbs, Douglas Stewart and Carl Stotter. He'd attempted to strangle all 3 of those men. And somehow, they got away. Now, Nilsen's defence tried to undermine the testimonies by introducing evidence of the 3 men's sexual encounters with Nilsen, but it's said that the harrowing accounts inflicted serious damage on the defence case. I know the defence's job is to just poke holes in the prosecution's case, but in this case, the guys told him, yeah, did it. The physical evidence used in the trial included photos of the murder scene, the chopping board he used to dissect his victims, and the cooking pot that he used to boil off the flesh from feet, hands and heads. This is now on display at the Black Museum at Scotland Yard. So Nilsen was assessed by 2 psychiatrists by the defence, Dr. James McKeith and Dr. Patrick Galway, and the defence relied heavily on their testimonies. Dr. McKeith spoke about how Nilsen's troubled childhood, his inability to express feelings, and the resulting separation of mental function and physical behaviour affected his own sense of identity and implied an impaired responsibility on Nilsen's part. However, under intense cross-examination by the prosecution, he was forced to retract his judgment about diminished responsibility. Dr. Galway diagnosed Nilsen as suffering from false sense syndrome, and this is characterised by outbreaks of schizoid disturbances, which, according to Google, is a condition where a person shows very little, if any, interest and ability to form relationships with other people. This is said to have made him incapable of premeditation, but most of his testimony was extremely technical, even giving judges cause to question the complex diagnosis. Now, I'm not a psychologist, obviously, but it didn't seem like he was unable or uninterested in personal relationships, or being able to make them. In fact, it seemed like he was very concerned with bonding with people, and obviously he didn't want to be on his own. And incapable of premeditation. He admitted that he didn't remember killing one of these guys, but that he was walking towards him while he was eating with the intention of killing him. So, yeah, shit psychologist. But hey, because I'm not a psychologist, what do I really know, you know? The prosecution called Dr. Paul Bowden as their rebuttal psychologist, and he spent considerable time with Nilsen. I can't comment on the others. And he found that there was no evidence for most of the testimony put forward by the defence psychologists. Fancy that. Bowden did say that Nilsen was manipulative. There were signs of mental abnormality. And as we've said, even the untrained eye could have seen that. But nevertheless, that Nilsen was cognizant and responsible for his actions. Maybe I should have been a psychologist. During the summing up, the judge dispensed of the majority of the psychiatric jargon, as this had perplexed the jury. Perplexed is such a good word. He instructed them, simply, a mind can be evil without being abnormal. On November the 3rd, 1983, the jury retired, but they were somehow unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Again with the reallys? I mean, the guy confessed, wrote literal notebooks full of details, unless it was just they weren't sure whether to convict him of murder with the diminished responsibility or just murder, maybe. But the following day, the judge said that he would allow a majority verdict. So at 4:25 p.m. on the 4th of November, Nilsen was declared guilty on all 6 counts. He was sentenced to life in prison and wouldn't be eligible for parole for at least 25 years. This was then later changed to a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. Dennis Nilsen served 34 years in prison before he died aged 72 on the 12th of May 2018. He had been taken to hospital on the 10th of May after complaining of severe stomach pains. Nilsen was found to have a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, although this was repaired, but he later suffered a blood clot. Nilsen's cause of death was listed as a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal hemorrhage. He was cremated in June 2018 and his ashes were given to his next of kin, Mark Austin, and Mark had been his pen pal. Now, Nilsen had requested that his ashes be scattered at the bottom of his old Melrose Avenue garden, where he'd burned his victims. So, he wanted his final resting place to be with his victims. Okay. Thankfully, Mark refused his request, stating that he thought it was an insult, and that when the time came, he would probably scatter him in Farnborough, in the sea. So, the little town Nilsen so desperately wanted to leave as a child. That's very fitting. In 2020, this case was actually made into a TV miniseries on ITV, and it was called Des, with Doctor Who star David Tennant playing the killer. Now, I'm sure you're all wondering what happened to Dennis's beloved dog, Bleep. And, I wish it was good news. I'm sorry, guys. Even Nilsen worried about what would happen to Bleep if he was arrested. But, I'm not even going to go there, idiot. After his arrest, Bleep was taken to Battersea Dogs Home, where she was said to have pined herself almost to death. Oh, the unconditional love of a dog. My heart for poor Bleep. The powers that be, wankers, decided that no one would want to adopt a murderer's dog. I think you'd find that it would actually be the other way around, but okay. And just days after Nilsen received his life sentence, at 8 years old, Bleep was put to sleep. Now, I'm sorry that had such an especially awful ending. Animals always get me. But if you did make it to the end, thank you. Next week, we are off to New York via Ireland, and it's a doozy. So until then, You can find me on all the socials at Seriously Now Pod. And for your content requests, feedback, Seriously You stories, or just generally to drop in and say hi, it's seriouslynowpod@gmail.com. So until next time, lovelies, stay safe, stay free, and stay weird. Bye-bye.